that is difficult but inevitable. That's why we want to remind you that it doesn't have to be so scary. Our mission is to educate, center, and intrigue you while making tasteful humor along the way. Welcome to another episode of Home is Where the Grave Is. We are your hosts, Dulce.
And I'm Unity. Join us in our journey to educate, intrigue, and center ourselves on the subject of death and what comes after.
Well.
Hello.
Well.
Hello.
Can you see my mummified fetal pig?
I can. It is your centerpiece for sure.
I'll slowly start filling this wall with every creepy thing I can find.
Oh my gosh. I believe in you. I believe we have much more to witness.
This weekend, I made a carnivorous plant terrarium.
Ooh.
I've been catching bugs and letting them in there to die.
Funny enough, your brother did the same thing.
Nice. Well, the plants I bought were apparently from a woman-owned company, and it solidifies my idea that this community of liking dead things is primarily women. And I don't know what that says about it. We're not serial killers, but we like dead things.
Let's be fair. We are morbid. We are macabre, morbid individuals, and I think it's because we live in a constant state of anxiety and fear. But that's just my opinion. Because think about the crew that are hardcore true crime enthusiasts. Mm-hmm. We go to bed listening to that stuff. Mm-hmm. It puts us to sleep.
You're like, oh, yeah. That's why I don't keep my windows open. Oh, yeah, that's why I shut my attic because I'll get murdered that way. Oh, yeah, that's why I check every door at night because I'll get murdered. Everything is murder.
Welcome to our podcast where we talk about coping mechanisms with anxiety.
Don't trust your neighbors because they'll murder you.
Yes.
Even little kids are murderers these days.
I mean, have you seen a good horror movie? It always has to do with the little child.
You see how many toddlers are shooting people now?
I know. It's really sad. It's really sad.
So anyways,
yeah.
That again feeds into our topic of today is Gothic literature, where we are talking about these dark stories, these melodramatic narrative devices, murder, intrigue, mystery. Why is the neighbor mysterious? Why is their house always so dark?
Darn you did it again. I was thinking about it. I was like, where are we going with this? There's no way this is going to tie into Gothic literature.
So yes, today we're talking about Gothic literature and the contributions that Black writers have made to it. Because when we talk about Gothic literature, you always think about, Edgar Allan Poe, Edward Gorey. Those are all very white Caucasian men specifically. We do have Mary Shelley, who created Frankenstein's monster. And but yeah, we don't really hear much of people of color. And to preface, Gothic literature in general terms is defined as writing that employs dark and picturesque scenery, startling and melodramatic narrative devices, an overall atmosphere of exoticism, mystery, fear, and dread. Often, a Gothic novel or story will revolve around a large ancient house that conceals a terrible secret or serves as the refuge of a especially frightening and threatening character.
Ooh.
For you kids, it's like every episode of Black Mirror.
Pretty much.
Or Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even if it's not advertised, there are numerous Black writers that have made significant contributions to Gothic literature.
Absolutely.
I wish they turned their books into movies. Like, damn.
They have some really amazing pieces. I'm just saying.
Because they offer a unique perspective and experiences that add depth and diversity to the genre.
Yep.
You know, it isn't just a cranky old man. It's generational trauma. It's slavery. It's like all these other things that we could learn something about reading about it.
You can't fabricate trauma, my guy.
Uh-huh. So Unity, introduce us into the first writer we'll be talking about.
So first, we're going to be talking about Miss Harriet Ann Jacobs. She was born into slavery, but hid in an attic crawl space for 7 long years. After experiencing horrendous sexual advances and abuse from her master, after escaping to the North, she began writing a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which combines Gothic literature with a slave narrative. Jacobs uses her personal history to examine the topic of sexual abuse, rampant within the institution of slavery, of course, through a Gothic lens. Incidentally, in the antebellum period, the cult of true womanhood was prevalent among upper and middle class white women to possess the virtues of piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. At the same time, the institution of slavery made it impossible for African American women to control their virtue, as they were subject to the social and economic power of men, which Jacobs and other Black writers touched upon. In the narrative, she explains life events that prevent her character, Linda Brent, from practicing these values, although she wants to. For example, as she cannot have a home of her own for her family, she cannot practice domestic virtues. It's a pretty good example. I mean, if you can't control that part of your life, what are you going to do?
All you people trying to claim slavery wasn't all bad, I think you need to read your history books again.
Yes, I think, well, no, because a lot of the history books don't have this information. They just need to go read books.
Yep. Read books, people. Another thing I remember reading about once is the theft of Black mother's milk.
Yes.
Because they would have the care for a white child while having their own child, so all their milk would go towards the white child, and sometimes their babies would end up starving to death.
Yep, their babies would starve to death, or their babies were already taken away from them to be sold at the market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, too, because I always have this reoccurring memory. I don't know if you have a memory like this. So when I came back to the States, I was 11, 12, and I was put in the 5th grade, right? So this core memory is from either the 5th or 6th grade. I remember we were talking briefly about slavery in the U.S. And I mean, it was brief. It was just Black people were slaves. And we move on to the Civil War. And you were like,
it happened. Get over it.
It was so quick. And I was just like, what? But I just remember the tempo and the feeling in the classroom was just, you could cut, the tension was so much that you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. Like, that's how thick it was. I'm like, but why? Like, I understand it's horrible, but we talk about a lot of horrible things. Why aren't we talking about this? And I was just so confused.
Exactly. For people that don't know, us Southerners grew up during, especially if you're our age, which is early 30s, late 20s, there was our childhood was very basically characterized by Southern history being completely rewritten to make Southern states look good or better. You know, the Civil War was about state rights, not about slavery. And slavery wasn't all that bad. And that they were all just lazy people, and that's why they didn't work so hard sometimes. And blah blah blah. We really got the sugar-coated version of most of America's most important history. Especially, we didn't really even talk about the Reconstruction, which is when all those Jim Crow laws came along. Or how, like, the black vote was suppressed. None of that.
Nope.
I remember when I asked about why I was learning a different version of history from books than I was in class. My teacher had to pull me aside and tell me that my version was correct, but she wasn't allowed to teach that in school. Read books.
That is a very sad, I have to say, this is a very sad reality that had to happen that way, but that is such a good teacher to not shut you down and gaslight you and be like, you're wrong. You're wrong.
But the fact that poor teachers are still being subjected to this skewed take on history by people that have no right to be dictating it. You know, like what is school boards sometimes aren't even people with any like education or like with an actual degree anymore.
They're not even yeah, anyway.
I digress.
Would you like to introduce our next writer?
Our next writer is Toni Morrison. Although she is primarily known for her work in African American literature, her novel, Beloved, is often considered a Gothic masterpiece. Seth, the protagonist and a fugitive slave, is haunted by the ghost of her deceased daughter, and the novel explores the themes of slavery, trauma, and the supernatural. Seth is haunted by a past wrongdoing. She murdered her infant child rather than allow her to be recaptured and returned to the life of a slave. She had several other children, so she only managed to murder the first one before she realized she could escape. Years later, the child reappears, first in the form of a ghostly presence that throws objects around the room, and then the form of a mysterious young woman who calls herself Beloved.
That's sad and traumatizing, but a very
I'm sure that happened a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yep.
And you know what makes me think about this? These are such good writings. But also, I think it's a sad reality that I've also heard from other like Black creators on TikTok is when they talk about, you know, our entire existence revolves around slavery because it's a very real thing. Absolutely. And it's such a terrible deep wound that's been caused to their people. But what's sad about it is that it also robs them of whimsical things, other things. They don't get to be happy. They don't get to be calm or peaceful. They always have to be going through something, huge, horrible ordeal. And I think a lot of them were expressing was like, I just want to be whimsical. Okay. I don't want to have to be talking about the next terrible thing that's happening to a Black person on the news. I don't want to be talking about the slavery in school. Like, I just want to exist. Is that okay? And I'm like,
but
yeah.
Then at the same time, they find it hard to detach themselves from that.
Yeah.
And speaking of literature, you know, slaves weren't taught to write or read. So they had to learn all that later, which is why one of the first books we have on slave narratives was by a white dude. The famous Song of the South by Disney. Turns out it was racist, but it wasn't because they made it racist, because the source was racist. So yeah, you don't really start seeing like literature written by Black people until like later.
And let's be honest,
people are able, yeah.
Let's be honest about this. Anytime anyone from an outside culture tries to explain how that culture works is terrible. It never works out well. Like, they'll get maybe the bare minimum surface level of that culture, but they cannot explain it to the way the culture can, even if they are engrossed in it for a period of time. They don't understand it the same way.
A good example of that is Memoirs of a Geisha.
Yes. Even though that is one of my favorite books growing up, it's not.
I watched the movie. I was like, oh my God, this is terrible.
Yeah.
This is absolutely terrible. First off, the movie didn't use any real like Japanese actors. They were all like Chinese. But yeah, it ended up being about I'm a woman and I like this man and I would do what I want to get this man. Instead of like the geisha world being one of dignity and respect, and these women are obviously extremely well educated and very talented, and instead the author ends up treating them like prostitutes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that happens to so many of my favorites. So like another one of my favorites, Pearl S. Buck, she was a white woman, a prominent white woman that wanted to write about the culture of Chinese farmers. Mm-hmm. And she wrote, and it's like, oh, it's so profound and it's so descriptive and it goes into all these in depths. But again, it takes on a perspective that is not the real perspective of the Chinese people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't deliberate on how those people actually feel towards like their poverty, their indifferences or their differences and indifferences, their own people versus like it brings in the geisha community again. And I'm like, okay. And that's, yeah.
It's not to say that white people can't write books on other. Right. All it really takes is let people tell their stories.
Yes.
If you're going to write a book about Chinese farmers, then talk to a Chinese farmer and let them tell their story.
Yes.
Like journalists, that's what we do. Talk to people and relate their stories. And I'm not going to make up a story for them, you know?
Right. And there's nothing wrong with writing a book and being like, this was my experience with this subculture or this culture. You can write that. And that doesn't take away from their culture. Anyway.
Just do your research. So anyways, moving on to the next author.
We're having great narrative. So the next author is going to be Nalo Hopkinson. From 1960 to present. So, a Jamaican-born Canadian writer, Hopkinson incorporates elements of Gothic horror in her works. Her novel, Brown Girl in the Ring, 1998, is set in a dystopian Toronto and incorporates Caribbean folklore and magical realism. That sounds exciting, and I do want to read that.
Mm-hmm.
I am super excited about that. The first two I have read portions of it, but I haven't finished the other two. Mm-hmm. But this one I haven't been able to get to yet, and I'm pretty excited about it.
And then we have Lavalle from 1972 to present, an American writer of mixed African-American and Puerto Rican heritage. Lavalle has written several Gothic-inspired works. His novel, The Changeling, from 2017, is a contemporary take on the classic changeling myth and explores themes of parenthood and madness.
Ooh. I like that idea.
I'm sure everybody knows what a changeling is, right?
If I'm not
They
mistaken.
steal away the child, and then they take the place of the child.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was wrong. Yes, so they
Girl.
Don't come for me.
I already did.
So rude. But yeah, you're absolutely right. They take the place of the missing child and they grow up in the family.
Mm-hmm. That's where you introduce the techniques to figure out if your child is a changeling or not, and how to get rid of them and bring back your real child.
But could also feed into the madness that is an actual disorder, psychological disorder from mothers, where they commit familicide because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yay! Moving on, we have Jewel Gomez, 1948 to present, an African-American writer known for her contributions to speculative fiction. Gomez's novel, The Gilda Stories, circa 1991, is a Gothic vampire tale that spawns several centuries, touching on themes of identity, race, and sexuality.
Ooh.
So see, we're starting to see, as we move further away from the earlier 1900s, away from the immediate slave experience, we're starting to see more of a fantasy, lighthearted, but still Gothic and still dealing with the issues that Black Americans have to deal with.
I'd be curious to know how these books, what kind of impact these books had on their time. Because I remember there was a time period when people started trying to find out where specifically their ancestors had come from. Like, not everyone's from Africa. They might be from Madagascar, or the islands, or even New Zealand. And then sexuality, that's a topic that we're still discussing today, and we're still trying to figure it out. But yeah, I'd be interested to see, how these books, what kind of impact they had at the time period.
At the time period will be interesting because I know at least they've contributed to present day where Black Americans are coming together and they're trying to, like, those shows where they're like, oh, let's find your ancestors. Let's do ancestry.com, that kind of thing. Black Americans have actually collectively come together to try and hunt down their ancestors because, especially if they've been in America and they've been in America several generations, they were poor record keeping. They were from slaves a lot of the times, which means there were zero records. So it's very hard to go back any further than the slave trade, which is pretty awful.
I have a story. So I remember reading and watching a video that went with it.
Okay.
There was this family that brought a song with them over from when they were taken from their home of origin. And they just kept passing that song down generation to generation. And at that point, they didn't even know what language it was in. But they knew the song and they knew the words. They know what language, they know what country. And then the first, some historians started recording it. Somebody recorded one of the family members in the 1930s, I think. And then again in the 1980s. So the first instance was the grandmother. And then the 1980s was the daughter of the original woman.
Wow.
And that's when they finally found out that the song was a funeral song from a very specific region in Africa.
Wow.
And it was obviously in a different language, but they passed it down, and that was the one link that they still had to their home of origin.
It's amazing. And I love learning so much about how Black Americans were able to find ways to preserve their culture. That being one of them is passing down a song through generations. And I love learning the different methods, like they would braids, hairstyles, beads, like those were different ways to still pass, even in like embroidery or clothes. So those were ways to pass down stories and like culture from one generation to the next without it being taken away.
And speaking of, our next writer is Octavia E. Butler. It's another take on vampires, except this one is depicted in a very scientific light with in-depth descriptions of the symbiotic relationship between members of the blood-drinking species called the Inna and the humans who bond with them.
Ooh.
The main character, Sori, is a hybrid Inna who has been genetically modified to have darker skin and therefore be resistant to the Inna's main weakness, the sun. Because of this difference, however, some other Inna despise Sori and seek to kill her and her family. In this way, Butler blends the classic vampire myth with an exploration of race and prejudice.
So going right back into writing from experience and trauma. So the next writer that we're going to be transitioning into is the great Tananarive Due, 1966 to present day. An African-American author known for her horror and speculative fiction. Due's novel, My Soul to Keep, circa 1997, blends elements of Gothic horror with African mythology, and explores themes of immortality and power. Ooh. That sounds like a great movie. It should be made into a movie.
All these should be made into movies.
One of the harder things that I find, and maybe it's just my inability to have good researcher skills, I don't know, but I have a hard time finding a lot of African mythology, which I think is really fascinating because the bits and pieces that I do get, they're really intricate, colorful stories. Like, I want to learn more, but it may be a lot of it is closed practices or maybe closed off. Maybe it's harder to find because
I think it's just scattered.
Stolen.
It's scattered. You have to I remember there's this artist known for painting a blue dog, and he incorporates a lot of that Caribbean culture from New Orleans, a lot of African mythology. and all surrounding around this blue dog, which was a real dog that was deceased. And now he carries the spirit of his deceased dog in this creature that appears in all his paintings.
Wow. Huh. It's just about finding it.
Yeah, and one of those mythological creatures appeared at that Death Museum tour that we took, which will be in a later episode.
Hey. So would you like to talk about
the
next one? Should be the last one.
Our next writer is Nydia Corafor. I had to look up that pronunciation. From 1974 to present. Although best known for her work in science fiction and fantasy, Corafor's novel Who Fears Death from 2010 contains Gothic elements as it follows a young woman's journey through a post-apocalyptic Africa confronting dark magic and violence.
Another interesting one to look at. Man,
These are all fascinating.
What's that?
These are all fascinating. I will be truthful. I've only read some African American literature, and this is inspiring me to read more.
Absolutely.
Because, like we said, reading opens your mind. And our last episode, we talked about how we can possibly get into these echo chambers when we create these fantasy worlds that are closed. And reading is the one way that you could actually read someone else's perspective on life, the way they view the world. Because that's basically what a writer does and is doing. That's their job.
Absolutely. And I think that it doesn't, regardless of whether we were exposed to these type of things or not, is not an excuse. And this is kind of our journey, like doing this and learning and exposing ourselves is that journey, that personal journey.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'm expecting you to choose a book from this list. I'll be choosing one, and then we can come back and talk about it.
Hell yeah. Let's do it.
And then after this, actually pick something from our countries too. I've read stuff from India about Indian perspectives. I haven't read much on Mexico though.
Huh.
Well, I mean, if it's any like a famous book from like Hispanic culture is like Water to Chocolate. And that's a great movie. I recommend that.
Yeah.
Great
I have
movie.
seen the movie, not read the book, but yeah, that is a good one. But I'll be honest too, like I am still exploring getting back into my culture as an adult, and I definitely have not read many books from India or Indian perspective. There is one that I came across. It's called the Sand Doom, something like that. I'll have to post it up here, but it looks really interesting. It's from the perspective of a woman that goes through like her daily life, her marriage, and the strifes of reality. Looks really good.
The one that we had to read as kids was a teenager who was arranged marriage to a young child who ended up dying. And then so she's left on her own to deal with her abusive mother-in-law because Indian women have to live with their husbands' families after they get married.
Yep.
And once the mother-in-law's other children leave to get married, meaning her other daughter, she's all by herself having to deal with the abuse before she eventually runs away and finally starts figuring out what kind of life she can have.
That depicted reality was always my nightmare. Yep. But,
not to say that arranged marriages are all bad, but
no.
you know, somebody should have a choice in it, meaning choosing to have an arranged marriage or not to have one.
Very true. And I think also like those horrible stories that come out, that's not everyone's reality. But for the ones that it does happen to, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
To acknowledge their experiences as well. This isn't us hating on other people's cultures.
No.
But you have to admit some things are better left in the past.
Truth.
As we mature.
But Black writers, should not be left in the past, and they should very much be elevated. And I think it's very interesting how we accidentally ended up only putting all female Black authors. We may have to do a part 2 for the guys. We can't leave them out.
Yes. But I do like that we are in an era now where we're seeing more writing, especially on TV, from people of color. You know, for us, it's Jordan Peele. Like, I freaking love his stuff. And the fact that he's able to make horror movies from a Black perspective, I have like absolutely enjoyed it. It is so amazing. And then, you know, we've been seeing stuff from like the Asian community, the Crazy Rich Asians. That was a great movie. Everything Everywhere All at Once.
So I have something for you.
Amazing.
That's really, I cannot tell you how much this made my inner child so freaking happy. So apparently this was made in 2015, but I have not seen it until recently. So I went on Disney Plus and I saw this little short. You know, do you remember the dumpling short of the mom that makes the cute little dumpling that grows up? Okay, so super heartwarming, super like touches on their personal life story, right? They recently put up that I noticed. It's called Sanjay's Super Team. And it's made by an Indian guy, and it depicts like him as a little boy and how much he loved superheroes as a little boy. But his dad was very much wanting to do the puja or the prayer and pray to the gods and be more enlightened and spiritual. So he wanted his son to participate, and it's just this back and forth that's happening, and they both find their own way to connect while appreciating each other's idea. And it's just every single detail down to the artwork and mannerisms. Like, I can't even tell you, like, I recognize it and I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so happy. Yeah.
Disney hasn't really made much Indian stuff, have they?
No, not good Indian stuff, because Disney did have the, you know, the Disney Channel where they had the reality kids shows or whatever, you know, like Zack and Cody, those kind of reality TV shows. There was one, it was after our younger years, so we really didn't watch it much, but I saw previews where they had a little Indian boy, and it's a very stereotypical, like,
oh, I remember that kid.
Yeah. And I'm just like, this is not relatable. Thanks. I mean, I get it. There are, you know, the first generation immigration kids that come over, and that is how they talk and dress, and that's how they experience things. But you also have second, third, fourth generations.
True.
Or you even have the ones that are still in India. You know what I mean? Like, we all have different experiences that you can bring to the table, not just one stereotype. But anyway, I digress from that.
I think we already summed up this episode, right?
I think we definitely did. That is to say, like, all these Black writers that we talked about have expanded the boundaries of Gothic literature and infusing it with their themes of cultural perspectives that challenge and enrich
race, politics, sexuality.
Oh, yeah. And they continue to enrich the genre with their experiences, which is amazing. And we should continue to uplift Black authors in all these different genres and categories. So, yeah, it's exciting.
Go read their books.
Go read books.
That's why our mission is to bring you the material and immaterial resources to help soothe some of your fears and grief.
Don't forget to follow along for every new episode every Monday on all major podcast platforms, to include YouTube. Go watch our videos. It comes out a week after the podcast audio. Also, if you want to pique your morbid curiosity, then join us on all of our socials: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and many more. Also, if you enjoy listening, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. You can also reach out to us with any stories, remarks, or questions at sweetprogressinc@gmail.com. Don't forget to get that merch on your way out at our Etsy shop, Delicate Death. Until next time, stay alive.
Stay alive. We always miss the beat.